you.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination?
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Today's theme is Saved by the Borg, but we're going to get to that in just a few moments. I first want to give you what I hope will be some helpful information to help you understand why it's absolutely okay to doubt what you are being told by mainstream media and even sometimes by people in positions of expertise. I think COVID is really the culprit here as far as opening our eyes as to those places where people would lie to us or there was a narrative to be pushed. And it wasn't so much trying to keep us informed so that we could be empowered and make properly informed decisions. It was an effort to keep us from seeing the truth. And that's the part that really stings. That's the part that makes you go, ooh, I don't know if I can trust these folks again. So I want to share with you something. This was pointed out by zerohedge.com. The Mayo Clinic, just a couple of days ago, endorsed hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, a curative, I believe is the language they used when treating patients with COVID. And yet, one day later, after this was publicized, and Zero Hedge was among the various news organizations that were publicizing this, now the Mayo Clinic has scrubbed that page, deleted the URL, and the URL forwards to a safe page. In other words, a page that is more on narrative with what was previously being told to us regarding hydroxychloroquine. So here's what it looks like, and they offer you screenshots of here's what the page looked like on September 25th. Hydroxychloroquine talks about the description and brand names and so forth. And look at this highlighted part down here at the bottom. Hydroxychloroquine may also be used to treat coronavirus, COVID-19, in certain hospitalized patients. Now, that's a pretty big deal when you consider that during the pandemic, and especially 2 years ago, during the extreme push to get everybody to take the jab or else, it was very difficult for people to get their hands on hydroxychloroquine unless you knew somebody who was willing to act in defiance of conventional wisdom, or at least what the conventional narrative was that was being pushed. Pharmacists would sometimes withhold, I'm not sure I can give this to you. Same with ivermectin. People who tried to purchase it through mail order found that they had difficulty getting it delivered to them. And then, of course, the CDC, among others, the FDA, would come out, what are you trying to do this for? There's only one way to treat that, and that is with this vaccination. There is no other way. Well, it turns out there was. So surprise, surprise. The Mayo Clinic comes out and says, yes, this is actually something that can be used. And again, I believe they used the language curative, which they also applied to ivermectin. Kind of curious after all that hoo-ha about, but we can't really describe it as such. So here is what the website looks like as of the 26th. Is hydroxychloroquine a treatment for COVID-19? Look at this. It's hard to read, but here's the little disclaimer down at the bottom. In April 2020, the FDA warned healthcare professionals against using hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine to treat COVID-19 unless people were in the hospital or a clinical trial. Data collected by the FDA found heart problems at a higher rate among people taking these medicines compared with those who didn't take them. Now, that sounds a little more in line with the narrative that was being pushed. Although, isn't it curious that I believe now there's some information coming out about people who took the jab having increased incidences of myocarditis, among other heart problems, blood clots, and so forth. Somebody's not playing straight with us. And I really appreciate this tweet that kind of summed up exactly how far that deception was going. Chris Myshak, sorry, I'm totally butchering your name, Chris. Crazy to think how this was happening all day, every day during lockdowns to control the narrative. Internet, mainstream media, and institutions all working in lockstep to deceive the public. Our founding fathers would be ashamed. Absolutely, they would. They would probably have reached for the tar and feathers quite some time ago. I don't know why we're so passive. I'm not saying it's the only way to go, but I'm saying at some point we should be able to put our foot down and say enough. So if you were wondering, should I ever doubt what people in authority or someone with a position of expertise, someone with credentials is telling me? Yeah, you probably should. In fact, let me give you a good example of where credentialism leads. We've watched this little battle play out over the last few months in the West Bonner County School District. And I got to show you this. This is from idahoednews.org. Look at that face. Oh, the Borg is happy. Priest River Karens, this is parents, rallied to the cause and successfully ousted 2 board leaders. West Bonner parents say they saved their school district. Volunteers knocked on hundreds of doors and called thousands of voters to successfully recall 2 trustees. Why did they recall those trustees? It comes down to one thing. Those trustees had appointed Brandon Durst as superintendent. And immediately the cry went up, oh, he's not qualified. Now, I believe at least 3 out of the 5 qualifications he checked off on, but there was one he had not taught in the classroom. So he did not have experience as a teacher. And there may have been one other about superintendent certification. But look, I'm not trying to be rude here. For those of you who have credentials or those of you who believe credentials are the keys to the kingdom, they're badges of compliance. And nowhere can you see that more clearly than in the way that certain members of this community rose up when suddenly someone who was not fully assimilated into the Borg was in charge of the school district. Now, when they talk about, we saved it, but you have to ask the question, what did you save it from? And here's where the article gets kind of interesting. Let's dive into this article from idahoed.org. So the article starts out by telling us a small group, this is a tweet, first of all, that brings into context what happened. A small group of entitled left-wing teachers and union activists overwhelmed the process. Hope they get a more conservative superintendent who will take back control of these local schools from these extremists. Now let's go to the article. By the way, I do agree with that assessment. This was really a very extreme group of people, but look at the sympathetic tone taken by idahoednews.org. What did you do last summer? A group of mothers and grandmothers in tiny Priest River proudly responds, we saved a school district. It was a relentless and months-long effort that included hundreds of home visits and thousands of phone calls. Yes, you know what else it included? Lots of intimidating visits to the district offices, lots of hooting and shouting and jumping on tables at district meetings. Yeah, a lot of very unprofessional behavior. But a core group of 10 with 100 more participating led an implausible community campaign to recall 2 members of the West Bonner County School District's Board of Trustees, and they did so with resounding voter turnout and lopsided results. Why would they do this? Why were they so incensed? Well, let's read on. And again, keep in mind, there's a very sympathetic tone for those who led the recall effort. The fallout from the election has left the board in turmoil. Oh, I guess an unintended consequence they weren't thinking of, with 2 openings, an absent trustee obstructing board business, and a quasi-superintendent, he is the superintendent, like it or not, although he is stepping down, who has said he is resigning, though he left the amicable and fair exit details up to the dysfunctional board. You can almost taste the wrath dripping from the pen of, is it Kevin who wrote this? I can't recall. Last week's regular meeting was canceled for lack of quorum. This week's special meeting is at risk because all 3 remaining trustees have to show up. But the community was heard at the ballot box and created a district shakeup that's getting statewide attention. You know, you may think it's because, well, they stood up to the juggernaut of extremist conservatism that was going to take over their school district, but that's not why they're getting statewide attention. They're getting statewide attention because, like a bunch of little Red Guard communists, they stood up and disrupted, and by any means necessary. A clear example of the ends justifies the means. They disrupted and undermined and did everything they could to deny Brandon Durst even the opportunity to try to administer. I wonder how they'll respond to the next superintendent, especially if they see that the problems didn't go away when Brandon goes away. Anyway, moving on in the article. How did they get there? Well, West Bonner was at the center of a months-long leadership struggle to control the school board's direction. When did that struggle start? Well, in December last year, a recall group agreed that 3 trustees were making decisions not in the best interest of their community or students. Now, the article doesn't go into any detail as to what that would be. So, realistically, the recall group of leftists, Marxists, they could be outright communists, agreed that these 3 trustees were making decisions not in the best interest of the collective, or their community or the students. We don't know what those decisions were, except that it was the left-wingers who were making the noise. They settled on recalling the board chair and vice chair and, of course, doing what they could to depose the superintendent. get this next line. This is so self-serving. The recall election fight was just really ugly. It was. And it was really ugly because of the character of the people who brought that recall election in the first place. And when I say really ugly, if you have the stomach for it, get on X, formerly Twitter, and look up Casey Whalen. He's a journalist who has filmed hours and hours of these meetings. Note the conduct of the people who were part of that recall effort. Note the way that they talk, the anger they show, the disruptive mentality they bring to these meetings, and then tell me, who were the real adults in the room? It's pretty clear. Brandon Durst was acting like an adult. He was actually far more gracious than I think most of us would have been. But the really ugly part was that smiling Borg sitting around a table. We saved it. We saved the district. Yeah, really ugly but successful, said one of the core organizers. By the way, they list out all the core organizers. I'm sure they would want me to recognize them for their efforts. But anyway, education became a villain and teachers were villainized, one of them said. No, it wasn't a matter of just villainizing the teachers. It was a matter of you had hardcore teachers union representatives going after people because they felt that their control over the kids was slipping away. Because what the article calls their small town values were under attack. Okay, tell us what those small town values are. The group felt it was fighting for more than an election. Retired teachers, business owners, kids, and grandparents alike all pitched in to challenge what the group describes as a spreading extremist movement. Okay, we're calling the names, but give us some flesh on this as far as what is it that was under attack? What is the extremism that was attacking you? They won't say. One says, well, it was an extremist point of view organized for the destruction and not the betterment of the community. Again, word salad, blah, 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 comrade. Give us some clarity. What do you mean? It was created around self-promotion. Of whom? For what purposes? This is just words, but with no meaning. It was missing out on what it means to help and support your neighbor. Okay, now we're starting to get into the waters of collectivism. What does it mean to help and support your neighbor, comrade? I'd like to know a little bit more about what they mean. Nonetheless, you can see this is obviously why these recall people were right. The community was inspired by the failure of a supplemental levy. Oh, so this is part of it. The community, in other words, enough voters in the community said, no, we don't want our taxes hiked. We don't want our pockets pilfered for more money to fund the school district. Okay, fair enough. An abrupt return to the language arts curriculum and the hire of Brandon Durst as superintendent. And again, it's not because he came in there with an agenda to, make this new Reich of students, molded in his image. It's because in their eyes, he did not have all the badges of compliance that would make him a member of the Borg in good standing. Not fully qualified to serve as the superintendent, lacking those badges of compliance, Durst was hired in June on a 3-2 vote, supported by Keith Rutledge and Susan Brown, the two recalled trustees, as well as Troy Reinhold. Now, Troy is the one who hasn't been showing up, or at least wasn't able to attend the last meeting, so they couldn't have a quorum, and, presumably these parents can't move on. I'm telling you, the childishness and ugliness of this is legendary. And so if it's making splashes that are being seen across the state, it's not because any one of those three, either the two recalled trustees or Brandon Durst, have done anything that was so outrageous why common people would be shocked and horrified. It's because a small, tiny, noisy, and organized minority made itself heard. God help those children. I have a feeling that, if you want to see some job security, become a therapist and go hang your shingle up in the West Bonner County School District. I'm thinking a few years from now, some therapists are going to be hearing a lot about the parents who organized and the teachers union representatives who organized this recall effort. And they're probably going to have to help these kids, be talked off a ledge of some sort. Now, extremism. Speaking of extremism and speaking of media bias, here is one of the greatest examples. Now, this is actually in Spokane, Washington, but it's close enough, and because it mirrors so closely that extremist canard that is so popular among Idaho's corporate media, it's worth sharing. The Spokane City Council has decided to denounce. You hear this? They're in the denouncement business now. Mayor Nadine Woodward for appearing at an event with alleged domestic terrorist Matt Shea and anti-LGBTQ extremist Sean, is it Fucht? Anyway, back in August. This was a religious gathering. This was a religious kind of revival, and apparently that was bad enough. But look at the choice of words: alleged domestic terrorist. Okay, if you haven't been tried and convicted, maybe that's a title you ought not be using around, since we tend to take off the gloves whenever government is dealing with terrorists, right? They have no rights. That's why we send them to Gitmo. They have no rights to a trial. They have no rights to representation. They have no rights to confront their accusers. Pretty dangerous stuff to be using when describing people with whom you obviously have some kind of ideological difference. But again, we don't really know why. And of course, anti-LGBTQ extremist. This could just simply mean someone who says, I'm sorry, I'm not buying what you're selling. I'm not going to wave the rainbow flag. I'm not going to tell my kids it's okay to cut off their genitals and take hormone treatments because they're feeling confused. Oh, that's pretty extreme, all right. And yet I would wager that kind of extremism is absolutely normal people reacting to an agenda that somehow has been foisted on us with absolutely amazing ferocity over the last couple of years. But to sit there and say the city council will now denounce the mayor for so much as appearing with them. Here we go. It's guilt by association, right? There's one of the common fallacies. This is the same kind of tactics the Nazis used to isolate and demonize opponents. Why, look at this, they're associating with people. Are you a known associate of this? I mean, even McCarthy would be looking at it going, you guys a little bit strident about this? John Birchers seemed pretty nonchalant compared to these extremist fighters, at this particular Spokane news station. Andrew Nelson says, the wise and all knowledgeable council, the city council has spoken, been on the edge of my seat, waiting for their wise counsel on this one. Okay, carry on now to the next issue of extreme importance. Yeah, what exactly do we elect city councils for? I mean, I'm asking this in all seriousness. Are they there to administer the affairs and concerns and policies of a municipality, or is it their job to make sure that people are being ideologically pure, particularly people in elected positions, and to denounce those who aren't? I guess the Spokane City Council feels like it has received its marching orders, and heaven help the people who reside within their jurisdiction. Domestic terrorist, asks Bradley Chestnut. That's a manufactured definition for patriots by the left so they can attack and go after people who love America. That was the main purpose for the manufactured riots in D.C. on January 6th. By the way, I know that's an unpopular truth. That is a truth, nonetheless. How do we know this? Because even the FBI now admits it lost track of how many paid informants it had working in that crowd on January 6th. They won't name them. You know why? Because if they name them, with those names will come subpoenas. With those subpoenas will come questions, and the whole narrative falls apart. The left needed this narrative in order to go after their political enemies. So it's not exaggeration to say it's a manufactured definition designed to smear and tar anybody who stands up for limited government, for the limits imposed by the Constitution on government, and for accountability and transparency. Yeah, you can't exercise all power if that's being wielded against you by the people you're supposed to be serving. So we label them domestic terrorists, and we'll have to do something about it. A drone strike might even be in there. I liked this tweet. Our government wants us to be the bad guys so badly. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so ridiculous. Violent extremists, buzzword BS. And listen to this truth, because this really is the truth. The people who are most often being called extremists. The simple reality is the majority of us just want left the hell alone. We don't want war. We aren't looking for a fight. We aren't trying to incite violence. We literally just want left the hell alone. Sorry, that's some strong language, but it's so true. And they're trying to, the people who are seeking power over us, well, we have to control you, are trying to provoke some kind of a violent reaction. So far, they failed spectacularly. Here's an interesting study as well, and I just include this because speaking of extremism, by a 9-point margin, voters see the Democratic Party as more ideologically extreme than the Republican Party. Take a look at this chart. I hope it's clear enough that you can at least see some of the details here. Share of registered voters who said each party is too liberal, 2020 compared to 2023. When it came to the Democratic Party, that's a 7% jump in 3 years. Appropriately liberal, it's down 1% from 2020. Not liberal enough, again, down 1% from 2020 to 2023. Look at the Republican Party. stayed pretty consistent here. How many registered voters said the Republican Party is too conservative? 38% 3 years ago, about the same today. Appropriately conservative, it's actually up 3% since 2020. Not conservative enough, that's up 1% since 2020. Kind of makes you wonder what exactly happened. I know we get all this talk. Well, the Republicans are the extremists, and the Republicans in name only. They're extreme, but not in the way that they accuse their opponents of being extreme. To be extreme is to actually have standards, to have boundaries, and to hold those lines. And apparently that's, as you're going to see, I'm going to share a commentary with you here in a moment that talks about how, hey, we need to just compromise and get along. And there are places where we can compromise. If you want to talk about where we go to eat lunch, okay, we'll compromise. You don't like Italian. I don't like, Mexican, whatever. By the way, I do like Mexican food. I would take that over Italian pretty much any day. But you see my point? That's where we can compromise. Now, you want me to compromise on my right to keep and bear arms? Nope. That's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. You can make all the noise you want. You can make all the frustrated sounds you want. I will not compromise on that. Well, are you threatening me? No. Were you planning on doing something violent? Were you planning on depriving me of my right to keep and bear arms violently? I mean, it's on you. If you see violence in someone saying no, that probably should tell you that maybe you're advocating something that would require violence to impose on others. You might want to rethink that move, friend. Just a little friendly advice for you. I like Matt Edwards' observation here. Democrats and leftists are deeply unpopular in Idaho. That's why they pretend to be Republicans and conservatives. That's why they lie to people for votes, and it's why they're working to change the rules to suit their sick agendas. And I think that's absolutely the case with this whole open primaries, ranked choice voting move. They can't win otherwise. They've got to be able to game the system. Now, I thought you would find this interesting. This is an opinion published in the Lewiston Morning Tribune. Idaho values, family values, patriotism, says who? Okay, if you want to see a great example of what moral relativism looks like applied, let's take a look at the words of Russell Gee. Russell starts out with, I think he starts with a pretty neutral tone. We decide what constitutes our values. Some rely on their church or political party to delineate important values. Who decides right from wrong, good from bad, true from false? These can be subjective terms guided by opinion, and a person's values can vary from situation to situation. People stick to a singular set of values about as often as they stick to New Year's resolutions. I don't know about you, but the people I choose to hang out with have a pretty clear sense of right and wrong. And it's not because they know everything and they're smarter than everybody in the room. It's because they have a moral compass and they're not strangers with their conscience. Believe it or not, your conscience is a much better guide than a politician's words on a piece of paper. But I digress. Russell Gee says, take honesty, for example. If a gunman enters your place of work, are you going to be honest when said gunman asks you where your coworkers are hiding? Would you tell the gunman the truth to save your own life? Or would you take one for the team? Values tend to be complicated, situational, and not absolute. Oh, and of course, we've all faced that, haven't we? I mean, who hasn't had a gunman right there, holding the gun to your head? Come on, where are the Jews? Are they hiding under the floorboards? Okay, it's a pretty extreme example, but let me give you another example of honesty, and let's see how this one holds up. Someone comes to you and says, let's say your daughter comes to you. She's in high school, and she says, Mom, Dad, there's an individual at my school who was born a boy, who thinks he's a girl. He dresses like a girl, talks like a girl, has taken on a girl's name, but still has all of his factory-issued equipment and wants to come and change in our dressing room and shower with us after PE and use our restrooms. Okay, now does honesty matter in this case? Do you tell your daughter, well, honestly, if he thinks she's a girl, she thinks she's a girl, then she's actually a girl. Or is there a time to say, okay, in all honesty, that's inappropriate. And I'm not bound to play along with somebody else's fantasy, and neither is my daughter. In fact, if it's putting her at risk, then we absolutely have a duty to stand up and speak the truth. You see where honesty sometimes, that's a more likely scenario than the person holding you at gunpoint. Come on, where are your coworkers? Why is it a likely scenario? Because it's being forced on us by courts, by activists, by well-meaning do-gooder politicians. And believe it or not, that's the whole reason why this has ever become an issue in Idaho in the first place. The legislature wasn't looking for, hey, what's some way we can make trans people or gay people feel bad about themselves? They're looking for ways to protect these young people because they have to. So when you say, well, you know, it's a very fluid thing and it's not absolute, yeah, especially if you're looking for wiggle room to get around reality. Yeah, I could see where honesty would be kind of a problem there. All right, back to Mr. Gee's commentary. We hear a lot about Idaho values, especially during campaign season. Ask any of the 1.84 million Idahoans, according to the 2020 census, what this term means, and you'll likely get that many different answers. It makes a great soundbite in a campaign speech, but that's about it. It's so fathomless, in effect, it's meaningless. I would wager to bet if you ask 10 Idahoans, hey, what are Idaho values? I think you would probably find 8 or 9 out of 10 would have a pretty good idea, or at least be roughly in the same ballpark. Now, he says freedom also comes with a plethora of definitions based on who you talk to. One person's freedom can be another's repression. I'd like to see that definition, by the way. That seems like a real stretch. That is why we have laws that attempt and sometimes fail to balance freedoms. That's not the purpose of laws. I'm sorry, Mr. Gee. The purpose of the law is to protect our freedoms, particularly our God-given rights, by limiting the power of government. It's not a perfect system, he says, but we thankfully can debate, compromise, and make changes. That takes immense thought, consideration, and cooperation. Currently, we seem to lack these traits as citizens and politicians. You know why we lack those traits? It's very simple, because we politicize everything. We make everything a government affair. And frankly, if I could be so bold, there are people who think that politics should be the dynamic behind every single human interaction. These are the control freaks. These are the credentialists. These are the people who think that it is their right and their prerogative to tell you how to live your life. And they've got it 180 degrees wrong for why government exists in the first place. Who sets the standard for weighing who is or isn't pro-family values? Now, he is right. It can become just kind of a buzzword. Certainly, there are cases where divorce is contrary to family health, but also cases where it happens to preserve family health. Similarly, giving a child up for adoption can carry a negative connotation, but it can also be the best thing for the child under certain circumstances. If classic TV parents Ward and June Cleaver are the model for family values, one could argue that a mother with a job is a detriment to family values. Well, let's see what's happened to the family since the latchkey generation. By the way, I'm part of that generation. Things have been on kind of a downhill trajectory since then. Please, Mr. Gee says, politicians and others who wear these expressions threadbare, just stop already. Tell us the specifics of what you believe in. Tell us what you are going to attempt to do to help the residents of this state and nation. Spare us the platitudes. Get down to business and get to work. Now, he needs to understand that. What are you asking them to do? To build more and bigger government, or to strictly enforce the limits on government so that it's protecting your rights and keeping you free? Maybe he needs to give a little thought to this himself. Don't get so hung up on your own definitions of these concepts, because that leads to intolerance and inability to compromise and gridlock. Well, gridlock is a good thing if it's keeping government from becoming bigger than it's supposed to be, or more intrusive, or more expensive than it's supposed to be. It all comes down to, do you understand what the proper role of government is? Based on Mr. Gee's well-intentioned editorial, I'm going to say he has a partial understanding, but could probably use some clarification. And as far as, well, there really are no absolutes, I have to ask, are you sure of that? Are you positive there are no absolutes of right and wrong? Absolutely. Think about what you just said. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to